For this first lecture of the first week, I want to talk about our textbook, Flourishing. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the last page of the introduction. This is page 26. So grab your book and look to page 26. I'm just going to talk through these last two paragraphs. He begins in this first paragraph on page 26. Each world religion is not simply one thing, but comes in many forms. What I say above is not true of all the varied embodiments of the Christian faith in the world today. It's not even true of most of them. And I think this is really important right off the bat to understand how Wolf is seeing world religions, whether we're talking about Christianity, Islam, Judaism, or Buddhism, or Hinduism, or any of these entities that we think of as world religions. It's crucial to understand that he doesn't see them as one thing. It's not like they begin as some kind of a solid entity and then they move through time and stay the same thing, but they as religions move through time, they send off many different versions of themselves. So when we think of what is a world religion like Christianity or Islam, on the one hand, we can try to define that and say there's this set of characteristics about those world religions, and we're not really going to be doing that. I think what's important for understanding Wolf's point of view is that a world religion isn't one thing. It's many things as it moves through time. And as we think about a world religion, we can think about versions of itself. Some of those perhaps leading to violence, some of those emphasizing instead a vision of human flourishing. And he is going to be, the question he's asking is not what's the true Christianity or what's the true Islam, but rather what are the versions of these different religions that emphasize flourishing and that are healthy or peaceful, lead to peaceful results in our contemporary world. A second thing that he goes on here, as it travels in time and space. That's interesting, right? That's a metaphor of a religion traveling through time. The Christian faith needs regular realignments with its own deeper truth. Such realignments are termed reformations. All right, so as a religion moves through time, it at times gets off track or changes to meet the demands of one era, and there's a need to get back on track or to change. And when we're thinking about an organization or institutional level, those are reformations, most widely known, of course, with the Christian Reformation. But I think you can look through all religious traditions and see points where they've reformed themselves to meet the demands of a new era. And if we're talking in terms of personal change, Wolf uses the term renewal, that there's a sense of not just an organizational change, but personal renewal that happens as an individual looks and compares where he or she is in relationship to the deeper vision of the faith that person holds to. He points to an interesting verse, again, coming from the Christian tradition, as Wolf does. He points to a verse in Ephesians. I exhort us as Christians to reform and renew our faith so as to lead lives worthy of the calling to which we have been called. So that's a sense, even a biblical sense, that you need to be continually looking back and thinking about what are the deeper purpose and vision of your faith, and renewing our own personal position in the faith, as well as the broader organizational alignment of the faith. So this is something that all religions do, and something that we as individuals do. A third point to see in this chapter is this idea of bread and the word. And that's something that's going to continue throughout this book. That on the one hand, there's bread or material prosperity, and on the other hand, there's word or spiritual meaning and value. And how do those things relate to each other? This is based on, in just a few pages before that, one of Jesus's responses, quoting the book of Deuteronomy in the Hebrew Bible, his response to the offer and the temptations of wealth and prosperity. Jesus says, "One does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." And Wolf uses that as a way to think about these two poles. On the one hand, bread or prosperity, which is on offer by globalization, and on the other hand, the word or spiritual meaning and value. How to relate those two things is going to be a key effort of this book, how those two things can relate in a meaningful and healthy way. And so he'll use kind of bread and word as shorthands for those two things. In his view, it's always, there's two temptations, right? Is there, on the one hand, is to make the word equal the bread, and that leads to prosperity gospels and really a nullification of the message of flourishing of these great religious traditions. And the other hand is maybe a violent opposing of the bread, of the global order, and that is one step that leads to violence within these traditions. A fourth point, which I really want to just kind of highlight, what Wolf is saying is that within each religious traditions there are the seeds of flourishing. And I love the words that he uses for a healthy religious tradition. They would lead to, within the individual, confident humility, creative generosity, and just peace. So those are, Wolf wants to say, within each of these major world religions, there are the seeds of a vision of flourishing, and those things could be emphasized in the traditions, leading to confident humility, creative generosity, and just peace. And the counter is also true within each of these world traditions, and we'll see this in our class. We're going to see that there are versions of these religious traditions which are do not lead to those things, but which are instead foster violence or emphasize not the flourishing, but the extremist ends of human action. And my fifth point is in the final section here. My hope that all world religions, each in its own way, can and will keep returning to their best selves through reformation and renewing. As they do, they will argue about many things, but above all, about visions of human flourishing, of the good life. And I think this is so important. What is the end result that Wolf is hoping for? It's not that everyone will suddenly come to an agreement that Buddhism and Islam and Christianity are really the same thing. No, he's saying that these are different religious traditions that have some similarities, but also some important differences in the vision of human flourishing that they put on offer to society and to individuals. And a healthy global order would mean that those religious traditions define that what flourishing means to them, and then there can be arguing back and forth about what is the best vision of flourishing, and people can join or decide to follow one instead of another. That's all fine as far as Wolf sees. But what he hopes is to emphasize and call these great world religions, which contain the hopes and allegiances of a very high percentage of the human beings on our planet, calling them to define themselves in terms of positive flourishing, and to find their best selves, and what would result is, I guess you can imagine, sort of a table with a lot of people gathered around it, a lot of traditions gathered around it, each proposing and thinking in positive terms about what they have to offer our global world, and they would each bring their best self to the table.